Good evening. Tonight I'm going to continue with the second part of the VOC history and the Cape at the time. This time around I'm going to focus on the French Huguenots. So the French Huguenots who arrived at the Cape came in roughly 1688 and constituted approximately 17% of white settler society at the Cape at the end of the 17th century. However, their presence at the Cape had a significant impact on the religious and business attitudes that were to emerge in this fairly insular community. They also arrived as family units, often with children, and this supports the argument that they were more inclined toward a stable religious and economic environment than perhaps their Dutch or German counterparts, who came mostly as single men. Roughly by the start of the 1700s, Holland had been experiencing an extraordinary era of economic prosperity, as mentioned the last time, which lasted for about a century. The United Provinces of the Netherlands, with Holland leading the way, had become the chief maritime nation of Europe. Many scholars report that the country had developed a special kind of mercantilism, which allowed the Dutch almost complete freedom in foreign trade and in the import and export of bullion. They further point out, for example, that although Calvinism had become the official religion, the Republic had long served as a haven for persecuted minorities, such as the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, and also Protestants from other areas like the low-lying areas of Spanish countries. Given this kind of liberal attitude, it is not surprising that the Dutch welcomed the French Huguenots after, as we know, Louis XIV insisted his campaign against his Protestant countrymen to oust them. Migration to the Netherlands also served the interests of Dutch capital, as many of the immigrants were industrialists in sectors such as the textile industry, the paper industry, glass and wine industry, etc. One could therefore argue that the common religion which the Huguenots shared with the Dutch state, Calvinism, had much to do with the preferential treatment afforded them. Scholars often talk about the Dutch cities that appeared to vie with one another in trying to attract the greatest number of Huguenots by offering them accommodation at minimal rentals and granting all refugees within the Netherlands, for example, bourgeois status, the right to exercise their crafts freely, exemption for 3 years from import and other charges, no matter how wealthy they were, and interest-free loans for the purpose of acquiring the tools of their trade. These were some of the things they were doing. What is abundantly apparent about the French Huguenot diaspora is that the highest number of refugees moved to Holland, with estimates ranging between 50 to 75,000 people, far in excess of the numbers that went to, for example, Switzerland or England or Germany. Certainly, while the wealth of the Dutch prosperity was undoubtedly a lure, it needs stressing that many of the Huguenot immigrants were poor, indicating that the religious factor was probably central to their choice of destination. As for the minority of economically advanced Huguenots, the nature of Huguenot commerce and industry, mostly as we see in history in the textile industry, suggests that these immigrants came with industrial skills that would have been welcomed by the Dutch state, especially given the economic rivalry between France and Holland at the time. The merchants and industrialists who fled from France to other European countries mostly remained in Europe because of the abundant economic opportunities that the region offered. This was, of course, especially true of the Netherlands. It was thus not merchants or those with industrial skills, but mostly Huguenot peasants who were accustomed to working the soil, etc., who made their way to South Africa. Although constituting a small minority of the vast French peasantry, these peasants were considered among the best and most productive cultivators in France, despite the generally poor and challenging soil that they worked. I read in the text that scholars often quote high-ranking officials in La Rochelle who grudgingly admitted by the end of the 1600s that there was no place in all the provinces in France where the soil was better tilled than, for example, on the island of Oloron with its predominantly Protestant population. The Cape thus offered these refugees little in comparison to the European cities of the late 1600s. However, the opportunity to cultivate and own farms in Dutch South Africa must have seemed attractive to at least a few French Huguenot peasants who might not have foreseen similar opportunities in Europe. When you look at the VOC records, approximately 200 Huguenot families arrived at the Cape between 1688 and 1700. If one considers that approximately 200,000 French Huguenots migrated or fled from France after Louis XIV's revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, then the small number that opted to migrate to the Cape speaks to the limited opportunities perceived to lie at the tip of Africa. Besides the limited opportunities, there was also the difficulty of travel that I mentioned the last time that the journey to the Cape promised. In 1685, the VOC directors, the year in 17, decided to send colonists to the Cape to support the refreshment station that was becoming more expensive to run than they had anticipated. Through collaboration with a small self-sufficient farming community, they envisaged, I would imagine, a reduction in the provisioning expenses for the company. As mentioned the last time, they were not going to spend money in that region. According to a decree or placard drawn up at the time by the VOC year in 17, if I can remember the Afrikaans Dutch, hulle moes getuigskrifte van eerbaarheid volgens die getuienis van hul kerkrade toon en hulself beskou as gebore Nederlanders. If I can translate that, they, of course the immigrants, had to present affidavits attesting honesty as witnessed by their respective church organizations and that they should consider themselves as native Hollanders, Nederlanders. The first group of French Huguenots was sent to the Cape under this decree or placard. The content of that placard supports the argument that the VOC administration at the Cape was intent on improving commitment to labor. The Huguenots had to sign an oath of trust, as if they put it in eed van getrouheid, with the VOC in the Netherlands before they could embark on their journey. In a letter sent, for example, to Simon van der Stel, the governor of the Cape at the time, the Heeren 17 insisted in their language that hierdie vlugtelinge beroofd van alles, maar hardwerkend en gou tevrede gesteld. These refugees, robbed of all their possessions, hardworking and easily satisfied. As already mentioned, the new immigrants differed from the Dutch and German immigrants in that they included a relatively high percentage of family units. Many or various letters written by the VOC administrators, for example, the Chamber of Amsterdam, and even the captain of the ship on which they were transported, give details of the names, gender, and place of origin of these Huguenots in France, as well as the number of children that accompanied them. For example, the first ship carrying these French Huguenots to the Cape, the Voorschoten, had 22 Huguenots on board. And if I think back of the names that I came across in the texts, historical records, Marais, for example, Fouchier, Leroux, Malherbe, Pinard, Fauchier, even though the French Huguenots at the time would, as I mentioned, would only constitute 17% of the early Cape settler community, the strong family cohesion and order that they brought with them contributed significantly to the cumulative attitude or ethic that developed among the early settlers at the Cape. More so than their small numbers would suggest, more so than their 17%. Furthermore, the relatively high percentage of children that the Huguenots brought with them from Europe before the 1700s, unlike, for example, the mainly single immigrants from the Netherlands and Germany, must certainly have added to the cultural contribution that the Huguenots made to the free burgher community after the 1700s. The Huguenots were also able to secure lasting economic advantages in the new society by being granted arable land relatively close to Cape Town, Stellenbosch and so on. This positioning was especially advantageous when considering the high cost of transportation over rugged terrain from inland farms at the time. Also, Cape Town offered the only market for the hundreds of ships that docked to stock up on meat and other fresh produce for the young voyagers between Europe and the East. What else can I say? Yeah, of course, in comparison to those free burghers who started farming after the first waves, the early French settlers were granted tenure to lands that were often many times more valuable than that accorded the latecomers. Those free burghers who arrived after the 1700s had to contend with many negative factors, including the high transport costs from the new frontier farms, competition from existing farmers, the difficulty in accessing slave labor in regions far removed from the Cape, and also very important, regulated pricing by the VOC. However, the relative advantages that the Huguenots secured do not in any way diminish the hard work and diligence that historians of the period so liberally report. Maybe here I can quote a guy called Louis Leipold, who suggests that before the start of the 1700s, some of the Huguenots were already respected because of their industry, productivity, and the manner in which they decorated their lone farms. This attitude contributed to material accumulation and, of course, the lasting legacy of the region, Stellenbosch and surrounds. I think I'll stop here, and maybe next time I'll speak about the early German communities and the religion that they are bringing with them, which is, of course, Lutheranism. Thank you. We'll speak next time.